Great to be in balmy Chicago. I didn't expect that. I always think I'm going to die when I come here. Anyway, let me begin by telling the story of an undocumented immigrant. She was in her mid-20s, maybe early 20s, when she crossed the border between Jordan and Israel. When she did that, she entered a country that had a long history of tensions with her own homeland. It was a decision that if you lined up the pros and cons, the cons would win hands down. There was nothing good about this decision that she was making. And it came on the heels of a litany of events that cemented her low status in society. No matter which side of the border she chose, she would live in the margins. She appears to have been a casualty of the patriarchal system and its preference for boys. She reminds me of a young girl named, whose parents named her Tamar. She was the fifth daughter, and the name Tamar means finished or enough. And it signaled their desire to end this long string of unwanted daughters. No one knows for sure, but it does seem odd that in a culture where marriages were arranged to benefit the family, that you would negotiate a marriage so that your family's stature would be increased in the community. This girl was married to a famine refugee. That's not exactly what you would call marrying up. The marriage lasted for 10 years when her husband died. And her widowhood, which was a terrible thing to happen, was complicated by the fact that during those 10 years, she did not have a single pregnancy. She didn't even have a daughter to show for her marriage. So she was certifiably barren. No respectable man would have any interest in a woman like that because a man needed to have sons. It was absolutely important, and the number of sons a woman had was the gold standard by which she would measure the value of a woman. So this young woman was a zero. Except for her mother-in-law's determined efforts to keep her from going forward, border crossing came off without a hitch. There was no ban on Jordanians. There was no wall, no barbed wire, no drones, not even any extreme vetting. And that's a good thing because she didn't have a passport, a visa, or a green card. To be fair, the reason that her mother-in-law tried to keep her from going was not because her mother-in-law was a racist, but because she was a realist. She knew that there was no future for her daughter-in-law ahead in Bethlehem, and she only meant to spare her. Poverty, hardship, exploitation, and perpetual vulnerability was all that waited for them in Bethlehem. We know how a woman like this would be regarded by some people if she came here. Once in Bethlehem, she had no means of support, so she went on welfare. She ended up as a field worker, scavenging for scraps of grain behind harvesters, picking up whatever was left after they cleared the field. And that put her in the path of a powerful landowner. The power differential between male and female in this story couldn't be more pronounced or more chilling. It's the kind of scenario that plays out over and over and over again, even in today's world, and where women end up being abused, assaulted, raped, or even murdered. Sometimes biblical narratives sound like they've been pulled from the day's news. Of course, the undocumented immigrant I'm describing is Ruth the Moabitess. and most of us have heard her story hundreds of times. We've heard her mother-in-law's story too, Naomi. Naomi shared Ruth's zero status. She left behind in Moab 3 graves, the graves of her husband and her 2 sons. It was a total wipeout of Naomi's life's work. But how her story has been told to us hasn't stirred the slightest twinge of sympathy for her. In fact, we've been critical of her for complaining. We've trivialized her suffering. We've blamed her for her troubles. We've been impatient for her to get over it and move on. We've convinced ourselves that with a little bit of luck, maybe a marriage and a baby would cheer her up and cause her to get over the grief that she has suffered. The Old Testament book of Ruth turns the spotlight on the plight of women in the world, and it is an issue that the church needs to address. It is an issue that is still present in today's world, that there are horrible things happening globally for women and girls, and we need to be aware of it and be on the forefront in addressing it. And it also is an opportunity for the church to learn from women's stories. This book reveals the passion of God for his daughters. It is an utterly countercultural book when it comes to the value of women. There couldn't be a more powerful statement of the value of women than the message we get in the book of Ruth. It also gives us a stunning picture of the gospel's power at work in the lives of human beings. For my money, it's the most powerful picture of the gospel of Jesus in the Old Testament. Yes, I know that we all look at this as a rags to riches story, a love story between Ruth and Boaz. But that's because we're missing the point. The book is much deeper than that, much more profound. And here's the problem that we face every time we open the Bible, and especially in the case of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth traditional interpretations throw us off of what this book is all about. We're told that it is a romance between Ruth and Boaz, that she is a beautiful damsel in distress, that she goes out to work in the fields of Bethlehem, and she happens into the field of this rich, handsome bachelor. Their first meeting, when their eyes lock, it's love at first sight. They fall in love. She proposes marriage eventually. They get married. She has a baby. And before you know it, it begins to sound like this. Seriously. You know, the problem here is that the Bible isn't teaching fairy tales. You try to preach this to a congregation, and they may enjoy hearing a pretty story, but it isn't going to help them in their own lives. Because life doesn't work like this for any of us. We all have our struggles. We all have points in our stories where we wonder where God is and what's happening with us. To get to the heart of the story, we need to remind ourselves every time we open the Bible that we are not reading an American book. That this is a book that is foreign to us. As Americans, we are as far removed from the culture of the Bible as you can possibly get in today's world. And if we want to understand it, we need help from people who know more about that world. We need to listen to people who come from patriarchal cultures and who can tell us about it. The story takes place within a full-fledged patriarchal culture, It is a world where sons are prized and daughters don't count. It's where a woman's value is determined by counting her sons. Sons are the gold standard for measuring a woman's value. A woman's value is always derived from the men in her life. Who is her father, her husband? How many sons does she have? Doesn't have any rights of her own, no voice, no value, no protections without a man in her family. And her sole contribution to the world is to produce sons for her husband. And that explains some of the horrible anxiety and agonies that women go through in the biblical stories when they can't get pregnant or give birth to a son. It's everything for them. And it is within that world that Naomi, in the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth, goes to ground zero of her own story. It is a terrible, terrible account, and the killer verse is this, that Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This book is not a romance story. It is the story of a female Job. It is the story of a woman who feels that God has turned against her, and she doesn't understand what's going on. Job questions God's justice. Naomi questions God's love. In patriarchal cultures, widows are the most at risk. They are at risk to abuse, poverty, trafficking, and exploitation. And it happens the world over. In India, in today's India, the widows speak for Naomi when they say, "This is not life. We all died the day our husbands died." In that culture, in a terrible statement of the value of a woman, when her husband died, they used to burn the wife on his funeral pyre. I heard the story of a 4-year-old girl who was promised to marry an older man in India, and he died. And she was declared a widow at 4. And they were going to burn her. And her brother had to smuggle her out of town to save her life. But that is the way women are valued in these cultures. If they don't have a man, they're not connected somehow to a male in the family. So it is an utter disaster for Naomi, and the cry that is heard from her in the aftermath is not overkill. She says, "The Lord's hand has gone out against me. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty." Lest we romanticize the world of Naomi and Ruth, let us not forget that Lot was prepared to turn his daughters out to an enraged mob of sexual predators. That Hagar's reproductive organs were commandeered by Abraham and Sarah. That Laban played chess with Jacob, his son-in-law, and used his daughters and 2 slave girls as pawns. Brutality against women incites the outrage of God and his prophets in the Bible. Isaiah tells us, getting way ahead here. Isaiah tells us, "Woe to those who deprive the poor of their rights and who withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless." Naomi and Ruth are instantly at risk with the deaths of the men in their family. Anyone can exploit or abuse them with impunity. Protections that we assume in this culture are totally absent for them. And none of this is lost on Ruth. She has witnessed the collapse of Naomi's world. She too is swept away in a tsunami of suffering. She hears Naomi's angry words against God. She sees her despair. She feels the brunt of evidence against Yahweh. And Ruth suffers too. She also is a widow, and she won't be able to conceal her barrenness. There won't be any eHarmony matches for her because she lacks the number one criteria a man is looking for in a wife. She understands the realities they face. She is young. She faces a longer road of suffering than her mother-in-law, especially as an immigrant in Bethlehem. She's no fool. The smartest thing for her to do is to turn around and head home. And Naomi is ordering her to do that. Go back to your people and to your gods. When a Job story is playing out, when circumstances are as black as can be, when the evangelist on duty is pushing her away, when humanly speaking, everything repels. Against all odds, Ruth embraces Naomi's God. Devotion to Naomi cannot explain what happens here. Something stronger than her fears of the future was pulling her forward. This is the power of light over darkness. This is the power of the gospel. Even at her lowest, Naomi is still a light bearer. Who would guess that God would use a desperate flight to Moab to rescue a pagan Gentile girl whose father married her off to a famine refugee? Or that the evangelist to reel her in would be a woman the world counted out? The gospel reconnects, rescues and reconnects God's image bearer with her creator. But the gospel does more than that. It transforms. It is a pivotal moment for Ruth. Her center of gravity has changed forever. She is Yahweh's child now, and she will live as one. The girl who arrives in Bethlehem is not the same girl as the one who left Jordan. She is counted out by the culture for all sorts of reasons, but she is not counted out by God. There are battles to fight. When they arrive in Bethlehem, hunger is waiting for them on the doorstep. And there is a dying family. Elimelech and Naomi's family is dying out, for there are no sons to carry the family on. And these battles will require boldness, will require Ruth to move out of her comfort zone and make radical proposals to a very powerful man. The power of the gospel rescues and transforms, but it doesn't stop there. The gospel unites God's sons and daughters in a powerful kingdom force. Naomi and Boaz, are Ruth's seniors. They are of the same generation. They both call her my daughter. And it is assumed that they are older than Ruth. They are true Israelites. They are seasoned believers. They have been raised on Mosaic law. And Boaz and the women live at polar opposites of the social spectrum. Naomi is washed up. She's postmenopausal. There will be no starting over for her. She's going home to die. And Boaz holds all the cards. He steps out onto the pages of Scripture and is defined by himself, his value is not derived from anyone else. He's a man of valor, a man of great stature, a man of resources and power and privilege. He holds all the cards. He is in impeccable compliance with Mosaic law. I read the story of a Palestinian man in the late 20th century. And he was married to a woman who gave birth to a daughter, and then she couldn't get pregnant again, and he was desperate. He said, I am nothing in this village without a son. Boaz was a great man of stature, and he would not have been if he didn't have sons. He was born to a prominent family and culturally empowered to lead. To put a fine point on his state of mind, this man had endured years of famine, a devastating famine, and he was in economic recovery and was determined to make Bethlehem great again. Ruth shows up in the story as a gutsy risk taker. She's female, she's an immigrant, she's young, she's poor, she's a brand new convert, she's marginalized, she looks different, she talks funny, she has no rights, no voice. But none of that matters now. Instead of staying out of his way and keeping her head down, she challenges his interpretation of Mosaic law twice. And Boaz remarkably listens to her. She unpacks Boaz. The result of her interaction with him is that the three of them, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, will change the course of history. Never know that they did it. But her conversations with him have enormous impact on him. Ruth lives on the Hungary side of the law, and the law reads very differently from that vantage point. She moves Boaz from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. The letter of the law says, let them glean. The spirit of the law says, feed them. The letter of the law says, responsibility for a family member falls on the shoulders of a blood brother or the nearest relative. The spirit of the law says God calls his people to care and sacrifice for one another. In this story, the Old Testament begins to foreshadow the Sermon on the Mount, and Boaz discovers through his interactions with Ruth that there are infinite possibilities for obedience to God. For example, in the barley field, he issues a series of executive orders to empower her. He authorizes permission to her to glean behind the harvesters so that she can get more. He gives her access to food and water. He bans his harvesters from harming her or abusing her in any way, and he issues a standing invitation for her to return. It is a beautiful example of a man using his power for good and to bless others. Boaz is an extraordinary character in the Bible, and our romantic interpretations of his story have cheated him of the credit he deserves. When the day is over, Ruth takes home 29 pounds of winnowed barley. It's at least 15 to 30 times as much as those male harvesters would have taken home for the same day of labor. It's well beyond equal pay for equal work. Ruth impacts Naomi too. God answers Naomi through Ruth. She's asked these big questions about God abandoning her and raising his hand against her. And God doesn't send a prophet. He doesn't speak from the heavens. He doesn't send a vision. He speaks to Naomi through Ruth. When Naomi is feeling most abandoned on the road from Jordan to Israel, she is held in a human embrace, hearing fierce words of covenant love spoken to her by her daughter-in-law. Stop asking me to leave you. I will never leave you. When she is feeling forgotten and depressed as she waits for Ruth to return home from gleaning in the fields. Ruth doesn't come home with stories of bruises and tears and rape. She brings home a boatload of barley and a meal of roasted grain. That is the moment that Naomi's hope in God revives, and she believes that he has not forgotten his chesed for her. The gospel's power destroys the dividing wall between people who are different from one another. And it happens in this book, in this story, at the threshing floor. At the threshing floor, 3 lives converge in explosive combinations that detonate in today's world, and we see it over and over and over again. You have male and female, powerful and powerless, valued and discarded, native-born and immigrant, rich and poor, Jew and Arab, nitro and glycerin. Instead of the explosion we expect to hear, the gospel breaks forth in Bethlehem. Reassured of God's love for her, Naomi seeks a husband for Ruth. She is not being a matchmaker. She is looking for mercy. She is seeking shelter for her barren daughter-in-law because she knows Ruth will most likely outlive her. It is the widow's mite. Ruth is all Naomi has, and she is giving her up. But Ruth has vowed to care for her mother-in-law. She's about to start looking for a husband for herself. She is bent on rescuing Naomi's family. And in an act of staggering faith, barren Ruth, volunteers to bear a son. When we find Boaz in this part of the story, he is at the threshing floor, guarding what belongs to him. The nearest relative spells out the terms. Enormous risks are involved for whichever man accepts this responsibility. And the nearest kinsman redeemer says, "It will ruin me. Can't do it." It means that he must take from his estate and invest in Naomi's husband's land to bring it up and running again. And if Ruth gives birth to a son, it's a losing investment, and his own sons will earn less. Boaz sacrifices his wealth. He is ruined to father a son for Elimelech. And Ruth makes the ultimate sacrifice and gives her son to Naomi. And Naomi, God redeploys Naomi. She's not worthless. She's got a job to do here. He redeploys her to raise her son on the theology that she learned in the school of suffering. Naomi is a shaper of our Christian theology because we learn from her the power of God's chesed. Her great-grandson, David, will write, "Surely goodness and chesed shall follow me all the days of my life." The gospel is the power of God to rescue against impossible odds, to transform God's people in radical ways, to unite God's sons and daughters as a potent kingdom force. When I read this story, every time I read this story, it blows me away. It makes me want to think twice before I ever rule anybody out. That God might use them to do important kingdom work. I mean, we so focus on people whose names we know that this is where God is doing the great things. But in this book, in this story, he's doing things, important, world-changing, cosmic things through people, through two women, the world would count out in a heartbeat. I mean, if you were looking at that day in time and saying, where are the great things that God is doing in the world? You would look in palaces, and you would look on battlefields, but you wouldn't look in a barley field where a young girl is scavenging for grain. And yet that's where God was working. I mean, and isn't it odd that we have in our Old Testament a book that's named for a girl who, if she lived today, would be seen as someone coming from an Islamic country, an Arab. And there we have it, that God works in amazing ways and unpredictable ways, and his image bearers, he's always raising them up to do things. And they were only focusing on immediate family problems. And yet through them, God was advancing his purposes for the world. I taught a class on this, on the book of Ruth, and at the end of it, I like to use the Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, put that test on this story, the George Bailey, where you sort of say, look at the story and imagine how it would have played out if Ruth had never been there. What would have happened to Naomi? She would have gone home alone. She would have disappeared into oblivion. Her family would have been extinguished from the community. And Boaz would never have been challenged in his views of Mosaic law. He would never have gained that different perspective that came when somebody with a different perspective put their eyes on the law of God and gave a different understanding of it. My jaw drops every time I ponder this story. It makes me want to think twice before I count anyone out when it comes to kingdom work. There are no zeros in God's eyes. Every image bearer is indispensable. Each one in this story, of the three of them, needs the other. They are stronger because they are together. If any one of them dropped out, the whole thing would have collapsed. God's kingdom advances because they join together to address local problems. It stretches my expectation of what God might do through me. Keeps me going when someone I love seems beyond hope. Gives me hope that despite the fall, God's kingdom strategy remains unchanged. He is still in the business of forging potent kingdom alliances between his sons and daughters. And when he does that, the world will know that Jesus has come, and that his kingdom is not of this world. For that to happen to all of us, we need a powerful gospel, and that is exactly what we have. I want to say with Paul, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God to everyone that believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile.